We're so thrilled that you're here with us today. And before we get started, I'm going to share a little bit about her. I am sure some of you have already done your research, but in case, I want to tell you, and we're in for a delightful time together. So Kristin Harmel is the New York Times bestselling, USA Today bestselling, and #1 international bestselling author of the Book of Lost Names, The Winemaker's Wife, and a dozen other novels that have been translated into 29 languages and are sold all over the world. And in fact, she just mentioned to me that she was up for a Jewish Book Award, the National Jewish Book Award, I believe. She'll correct me on that. She's a former reporter for People magazine. I have read her in People magazine, or did for years as a subscriber. And Kristin has been writing professionally since the age of 16, when she began her career as a sports writer, covering Major League Baseball and NHL hockey for a local magazine in Tampa Bay, Florida in the late 1990s. After stints covering health and lifestyle for American Baby, Men's Health, and Women's Day, she became a reporter for People magazine while still in college and spent more than a decade working for the publication, covering everything from the Super Bowl to high-profile murders to celebrity interviews. Her favorite stories at People, however, were the Heroes Among Us features, tales of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. In addition to a long magazine writing career, which also included articles published in Travel and Leisure, Glamour, Ladies' Home Journal, Every Day with Rachel Ray, and more, Kristin was also a frequent contributor to the national television morning show, The Daily Buzz, and has appeared on Good Morning America and numerous local television morning shows. So clearly, in some magazine or on television, you have seen her multiple times before today. Kristin was born just outside Boston, Massachusetts, and spent her childhood there, as well as in Columbus, Ohio, and St. Petersburg, Florida. After graduating with a degree in journalism with a minor in Spanish from the University of Florida, she spent time living in Paris and Los Angeles, and now lives in Orlando with her husband and young son. She's also the co-founder and co-host of the weekly web show and podcast, Friends and Fiction. So Kristin, we are so happy to welcome you to Washington Hebrew Congregation and our fabulous Empty Nesters group. Over the course of this year, while we've been mainly relegated to staying at home, we've relied on books and, more importantly, their authors to transport us beyond the pandemic and give us an opportunity to both escape and connect to one another. We've enjoyed traveling together to Mexico, Italy, and the Swiss Alps, Paris, and now back to France with you again. And we're excited to have you join us on this journey, and would love to start by having you tell us a little bit about the Book of Lost Names. And then I look forward to having a discussion with you about your book, about writing, and wherever else our conversation may take us.
Wonderful.
So thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. And thank you for that very nice introduction. And that was, it was nice to hear that the book club has continued to connect you through this. And I loved how you put it, that, that the books allowed you to travel so many places while we were kind of stuck at home. Because I think that's kind of been the beauty of books this year. It's always been the beauty of books, but I think we didn't realize until this year how much we needed that ability to transport us to other times and other places when our world got a little smaller. So yeah, thank you so much for having me. And again, all of you out there, if you have questions for me, just plug them into the chat. I would love to take your questions. For those of you who have not read the Book of Lost Names yet, I'll just tell you very briefly about it. It's the story. Oh, and I also want to say it just came out in paperback this week. So if you don't have it yet, this week is the perfect week to go pick it up. If I don't, if it sounds interesting to you today, if you don't walk away thinking, well, I don't want to read that lady's book, but if you're interested after hearing me talk, it is in paperback pretty much everywhere, and it's actually Costco's book of the month, which I'm so excited about. So you won't be able to escape me further. You might have read me in People, you might have seen me on TV, but now I'll be everywhere. So the Book of Lost Names is the story of a female forger in World War II. Someone saying my voice seems a little low in sound. Is everyone thinking that? Okay, it's the story of a female forger in World War II who stumbles into the French resistance, mostly by accident, and winds up helping save the lives of hundreds of children. So she and her mother are fleeing the Nazis themselves, and they wind up in a small French mountain town in the unoccupied zone, where a priest working for a local resistance network finds out about her false papers, approaches her, and offers her help in getting her father out of a detention center for Jews outside of Paris where he's being held, in exchange for her helping him with some forged documents. So she reluctantly agrees, and soon she meets Rémy, who's an accomplished forger with a little bit of a chip on his shoulder, who grudgingly takes her on as an assistant and then realizes that she's actually better than he is at these forgeries. So she's passionate not just about saving the children whose identities they're changing, because that's kind of the bulk of what they do. They are primarily forging documents for children. But they're worried about these children, especially the ones who might be too young to remember who they really are when they're sent on to their next destination. So she's worried about preserving their identities. So she and Rémy decide to encode those identities in a 1732 religious text, just a nondescript religious book that they find in the Catholic, the small library of the Catholic Church where they're working. And they begin referring to this book as the Book of Lost Names, hence the title of the novel. But toward the end of the war, after their resistance cell is blown and Rémy disappears, the book goes missing too, possibly looted by the Nazis as they're pulling out of France. And 60 years later, we meet Eva again. She's now a librarian working in Florida, where I live, and she happens to glimpse the book in an article in the New York Times, which is talking about Nazi looted books and the search to return them to their rightful owners, which is a real thing. It's a real ongoing thing right now. So as the story unfolds in the past, we also see Eva in the present, trying to summon the courage to go to Berlin to possibly reunite with the Book of Lost Names and to finally uncover the last secret that she's sort of been waiting for all these years that is held within its pages. So that's kind of the quick, easy summary of the Book of Lost Names.
Thank you so much. Hold on. Oh, there we go. I unmuted myself. So it's a fascinating and whirlwind story, and for those who have not read it, I encourage you to read it. And those of you, I can see some nodding. Really is one of those. I didn't want to put it down because I needed to know what happened next, and it just was riveting and engaging.
Thank you.
And such a different angle than so many other books that are out there in that story of the forgers, and especially a woman as the forger. And I'm curious what drew you to writing about forgery, and if that's something you know something about, or what was the what led you to that topic?
Are you asking if as a side job I just forge IDs for people? Yeah, it's a little.
Did you have your mom's signature down, on the notes when you were in high school?
Only I thought of that. No, I never did any of that. And I was always the, like in college before you're 21, a lot of people have false IDs. I never had one, A, because I just, felt weird about it. But B, because when I was younger than 21, I looked like I was 12. So like nobody would.
I get that. And I didn't have one either for the same reason.
No matter how good it was, it just never would have worked. But even when I was 21, people were like, and I'm like, I swear. But so anyhow, this is I think my fifth World War II novel. And so I've been writing about World War II for a while. My first World War II novel was The Sweetness of Forgetting, which came out in 2012, which I wrote in about 2009, 2010. So I was just thinking the other day, gosh, I've been doing this for about 12 years, writing about this particular subject matter. But in several of my novels, including my two most recent before the Book of Lost Names, which were The Room on Rue Amélie in 2018 and The Winemaker's Wife in 2019, both of those books, as well as The Sweetness of Forgetting, take place in France. And in each of those books, the French resistance is involved and people move from one destination to the next using forged documents. So it was just kind of something I took for granted in the writing of those books, because when you do a lot of World War II research, that's just how people moved around. Everybody had these, these fake identities and these fake documents. But while researching those books, I started to think, well, wait a minute, where did these forged documents come from? And who were these people forging them? And then beyond that, how would you get into forgery? How would you learn forgery? How organized were these bands of forgers? What kind of materials did they use? What kind of risks were involved? And the more questions I had, the more I thought, I feel like that would make an intriguing sort of central premise for a book, right? So I started to do a little bit of research, and I found that, there was enough there that was interesting enough. It really is fascinating how people found their way into forgery. But, there was enough of that I said, yeah, like I feel like I could frame a book around this. But there was still something missing until my literary agent sent me an article from the New York Times. Sorry, I keep hitting my microphone. An article from the New York Times about Nazi
And actually,
books.
sorry, Kristin, just real quick, because somebody, so we're hearing that the sound is not great, and I don't know. I invite everyone to try to turn up your volume on your computer. I had that issue at the beginning, but I just wanted to let you know before we continue.
Let me see if I can turn it up a tiny bit more on my end. I'm just kind of at my maximum, which makes me think that that might be a little bit better.
Great.
Is that a little bit better? Okay.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay, sure. Okay. So what was I talking about? Okay, so my literary agent sent me an article from the New York Times that was about Nazi looted books and the real ongoing mission to return them to their rightful owners. And that became kind of the perfect story to wrap around the story, because I had never realized that was the case before. I knew about looted art. There have been lots of books written about art that the Nazis stole, right? And movies about that too, but I had never read about the fact that so many books were looted. But the fact is, most German libraries today in 2021 still have books in their collection that were stolen from Jews and from other people that the Nazis kind of deemed enemies. So they took them from Catholics, they took them from Masons, they took them, from kind of whoever they could take them from, as they were withdrawing and, whatever. But in the Central Library in Berlin, which the fictional librarian in my story, who may or may not have the Book of Lost Names, he is actually a fictionalized librarian based on a real librarian at the same library. That Central Librarian in Berlin, a third of their 3 million book collection is stolen books, which I think is, I just blew my mind finding that out. And that kind of became the story to wrap around the story, because I liked kind of delving into the research of that too. And I liked the idea of a book that was so old. I mean, it's centuries old. It was used for something other than its purpose. And then at the end, it still had messages and secrets. And I love that idea that books are more than just the stories printed within their pages or the words printed within their pages. They mean something to us. And I think that's why it's so important that these librarians today are still working to return those books, because, if your book was stolen during World War II, right? Like, you might not still be alive, but your family members, it would mean something to them to receive a book, 70 or 80 years later that had once been part of your collection. I think that's really meaningful. Books carry stories.
I love that. And one of the things that flashed into my mind as you were speaking is this concept we have in Judaism, this tradition that that tells us that there's a midrash about black fire on white fire, that the letters of the Torah are the black fire, and that the white fire is, the space around it. And there is something to be read into that as well, and the dynamic between the two. And I hadn't thought about that when I read it, but as you were speaking, just this idea that it's not just what's on the surface. It's this really beautiful concept. And I was thinking as well, many of the people to whom those books belonged are not going to claim them, or family members are not going to claim them, but there's history in those as well, even in the notes that people sometimes will write in the margins, and or the notes in the front or in the back. And thinking about even this holy text that was in in the church, and the idea that that we have, people have Bibles in their homes that have the family story written in the front.
That's so true. You're totally right. I also think, I wonder if I can reach it. I have a book on my shelf that my grandmother used to read to me when I was young. I don't think I could reach it without, potentially flashing you, which is not a good outcome for today, especially since we're recording. But it's called Gus and the Baby Ghost, and it was my grandmother's book that that she owned. And when I would go visit her, she used to read it to me, and she has since passed away. But just having that book, it's not like I'm sitting down to read it to myself at bedtime now, but just having it makes me feel connected to her. And so books do have that meaning, and I'm so glad you brought up that example too. That's beautiful.
Thank you. So what kind of research did you have to do into forgery and into that? And we're not going to spend too much time on that, but what kind of research did you have to do in preparation to write this book?
So a lot. And, coming from a journalism background, the research always means so much to me. That kind of forms the backbone of everything I do. And it's like, you kind of have to get the details right, or the whole believability of the story falls apart, if that makes sense. But in addition to doing just a ton of reading about forgery and, reading memoirs from forgers, and reading notes about how forgeries were done, and reading, or seeing images online of forged documents, things like that, I kind of found I wasn't, especially in regard to the fact there were mentions of how papers, like you had to have exactly the right kind of paper to print exactly the right documents on. So much so that later in the war, when things were a little bit more organized, the Allies would drop shipments of papers made in other countries into France, so that forgers could use them, and so the forgeries would be a little bit more authentic looking. But I couldn't quite wrap my head around all of that, and so one of the interesting things, I love showing this at events, one of the things I got my hands on was a real life Nazi issued travel document, which is stamped in 2nd of December 1940. This was a travel permit. You can see the little heraldic eagle stamp on the bottom. You can see sort of the number at the top, the stamp at the top. Those were exactly the kind of things that forgers had to forge. And this was one of the most common types of documents, second only to identity documents. Like identity cards that you would have had to forge, because you couldn't get anywhere in France without it. You couldn't get on a train, you couldn't go to a checkpoint, you couldn't get across a border. Like there was nowhere you could go if you didn't have one of these. And so if you were a Jewish person who was on a list for arrest trying to flee, you needed one of those with a false name explaining why you were going from point A to point B. If you were a downed Allied airman who'd been shot down over northern France and you were trying to get out over the Pyrenees, you needed that to get on a train or to hitch a ride with somebody, because you could be stopped anywhere along the journey. So having that, I think, helped sort of solidify all the research in my head, because and I had a few other documents too. I had a children's baptismal certificate from, I think, 1941 or 1942 in France, which is something that especially for hidden Jewish children, that would have been very helpful in identifying them, establishing their identities as Christian children, which is what many of them were hiding under, that type of assumed identity. And I also had, just while I'm doing my little show and tell portion of the morning, I have the real life book of lost names. So the code within the novel is fiction. So the code is something I made up, and we can talk about that if you want. But this is the real 1732 religious text it was based on.
Wow.
While I was doing the code, I was turning to I would turn to page 163, and if I'd say, there was a star over the P in par, and a dot over the E in Saint-Louis, it was on page 163 of this book. So I was using this book as my reference throughout, and making sure that the code was consistent and added up. I never marked in the book, because that just felt wrong to mark in a 1732 book for no good purpose. But I use this as a reference, and photocopied pages and things like that. So the other thing I wanted to mention that was kind of cool about this is the cover designer never saw this, but look, like she got it almost exactly right. There used to be gilding on the front of the book too, just like there is here. And look at the spines of the two books side by side.
Very cool.
So she never knew this existed in reality. And she nailed it, which just felt like
amazing.
Meant to be.
Yeah. Just, and since you have the book out, I want to focus on that and the purpose of the Book of Lost Names, because we know Eva was forced to change her name to hide who she was,
Yes.
and hide her heritage. And when she's working on the documents, it's so important to her that the original names be preserved, that somebody knows,
Yes.
even if these children are not going to remember some
Yeah.
of them. And thinking about the importance of name to identity. And I'm wondering if you could comment on that.
No, it's such a great question. You know, I feel like today, right? Like you could change your name to Jane Smith and you'd still at your core be the same person because you've been raised. You know who you are. You know where you came from. You know the human being you are inside. But when you're two and somebody takes away your name and then tells you this is your new name, this is who you are, you're Catholic, you're Swiss, whatever, you lose those pieces that make you you. So names do carry something with them. And names now, I'm not advocating that you go change your name to Jane Smith because your name does carry your family's history and your name does carry, a lot of meaning with it. But particularly for these children, that was what attached them to who they are. And so there are a lot of real life stories of people within networks that hid children and helped move children on, where people found ways, such as burying names in a jar beneath an apple tree, for example, found ways to preserve those names. But it was very dangerous to do so also, because not only would the person who is preserving those names, therefore, obviously, be arrested and I'm sure, deported or killed. But then you'd put all those children at risk if somebody came across those names. So you couldn't just, write Sue Shankman has changed her name to Jane Smith and then, leave it on your desk, because then if somebody found it, they could find you and that could be the end, right? So it became very important to do this in a way that was undiscoverable. And it's interesting because I don't think I went into this book thinking to myself, gosh, there's going to be a deep message here about our identities and our names and, who are you born to be versus who do you become and all of those things. But I think that stuck with me enough that kind of became one of the central questions in my next novel too. So it's funny, like just the little research paths you go along and what sort of piques your interest and how that influences what you write next,
Well, we'll come back to that because we'll wait till a little bit later to
Sure.
hear about what you're working on. But I thought maybe we could spend a little time talking about the characters or at least some of them.
Sure.
And in particularly thinking about Eva and when we meet her family doesn't know about any of this past. It's like she had this first chapter and then this life that had nothing to do with that first chapter. And I'm curious why Eva never told any of her family about her past.
It's a great question. And I think probably all of you know, as I do, that I think people had very different psychological reactions to what they went through during World War II. So you could have two people who had the exact same experience during the war and just psychologically process it in a completely different way. And I think you probably would all understand when I say that I think sometimes, for instance, people who survived the Holocaust, some might make it a mission later in their life to talk about it as much as they can to make sure that people are educated about it. And some may never want to speak of it again. I mean, and neither one is wrong. Those are just individual reactions and have to do with our individual makeup and psychology and how we process grief and loss and guilt and pain and all of those things. So to me, that's a portion of it. But specifically Eva, her character, I think Eva feels a tremendous amount of guilt. I think she feels that the people she lost, it was her fault that she lost them. I think she blames herself. And I think that's guilt she feels she can't live with. And so her solution to that is to reinvent herself as somebody new, which happens conveniently when she marries somebody else and moves to another country and can just kind of put a wall up between the old life and the new life. But I think we all also know that you can't hide your past from yourself forever, because it's a piece of you. It's a piece of who you are, and you can pretend that it's not, and you can pretend that you can start over, but you can't. I mean, everything we've gone through since the day we were born shapes the people we become. Everything that we went through before we were born. I mean, just based on who our parents were and who our grandparents were and where they came from, and all of that. You can't hide from that. You can't change that. And I think that's something that Eva confronts in this novel. But for me, the central reason of that, for her doing that, was just the immense amount of guilt and thinking that she could move on from that, which is interesting because that kind of ties into the question you asked before about identity. I think it's interesting that Eva spends the war changing other people's identities and knowing that she has to preserve them, but then in the end attempts to change her own without keeping in mind that same kind of vital lesson.
And juxtaposing that with her mother,
Yep.
who, a couple questions came in, and plus I had one as well. But thinking about her mother, who was so rigid and unappreciative and complicated and angry in the way that she reacted to Eva, and all Eva's efforts to save her life. And she really didn't appreciate that or recognize it until she was faced with death. And the challenge of that relationship and the tension and the fear and everything that's wrapped up in that. Can you talk a little bit about Eva's mother?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say that's probably the one complaint I get about the book. It's, as an author, you're not supposed to go on and read your Amazon and your Goodreads reviews, because it's really just, you could read 100 good ones and then the one bad one is the one that sticks with you, right? You're like, oh no, someone hated my book. But any of the criticisms of the book are usually about the mother. Like, I didn't like the mother, I don't understand the mother. I get that, but I think the mother was very realistic. So I think that we would all like to think that if we found ourselves in a situation like Eva and her mother found themselves in, or like many people found themselves in during World War II, I think we would all like to think that our reaction would be to step up, to put our own needs and our own safety on the back burner, to do what we could to make the world better, or save the world, or save children, or those are the things we would want to do. I would like to think that I would do that, but I don't know that that's realistic. I mean, and particularly as a mother, I can understand, like I have a 5-year-old child. I could understand that if I felt that his life was in danger, he's not going to be out forging documents at the age of 5, but if progress him a few years, and were he in Ava's shoes, I can understand the mother basically saying, stop doing this, like, save yourself, like, what are you doing? And I also think that the mother, you have to understand, the mother got married young. She came to France from Poland. Her whole life was her husband and her child. She lived kind of a very sheltered life there in France, a very, and this isn't a criticism, but sort of a small life. Her world wasn't big. And that was very typical of that time. But Eva, even before the story starts, her world is getting bigger. And I think the bigger Ava's world gets, and the more she steps outside of the things that the mother feels comfortable with, the more the mother sees herself losing her. And the mother already feels that she's lost her husband, who was her entire life, her rock, her everything. He's gone. And now she sees herself losing Eva too. And not just losing her because she worries she's going to be killed, but losing her because she sees her making choices that she thinks pull her away from the person who she's supposed to be, and the way that she's raised her to be. So I think that that everything the mother does comes from love primarily, and a mother's fear about what's happening to her daughter. So all of it comes from a good place, but it manifests in a way that that provides, or that creates a lot of conflict, I think, between the two.
So one of the choices Ava's mother wants her to make is in terms of Rémy and Joseph. And, so when we meet Joseph, he's this charming, debonair Jewish man.
Yep.
And everyone thinks very highly of him, his looks, his, just his whole demeanor.
Yeah.
And even he has, these similar interests to Eva when we first start the book. So how can we understand his betrayal and juxtapose that with Ava's mother's infatuation with him, and the idea of him?
It's a great question. So on the surface, Joseph is perfect, right? I mean, he is the perfect choice for Ava. He's someone who her parents have always known. They liked, they liked his parents. They're in the same social circles. They have the same general background. Like and he's nice and he's handsome and he's successful and he's going places and, he's Joseph. He's great. But Joseph also thinks Joseph is great. And Joseph makes decisions based on thinking that Joseph is great. So that's not necessarily the best partner, even if everyone behaves, admirably. It wasn't something I necessarily intended to explore. When I started writing the outline, and I don't want to give any spoilers, but I didn't foresee things unfolding exactly as they did. But once I understood like once I began writing Joseph, I was like, yep, that's yeah, Joseph is going to make some choices that are not great. And I liked the idea too. In my own family history, back in 1920, I think it was, my great grandmother on my dad's side married my great grandfather. My great grandfather was Jewish. He was American. He was an American soldier in World War I, who met a nice French girl in Paris while he was stationed in France. And he married her and brought her home. And that was at a time when it was still not that common for a Jewish person to marry a Catholic person. Like that wasn't super accepted on both sides because of sort of, just sort of like all the cultural things that go into that. But yet they fell in love and they made that decision. And, I have to imagine that, there were parents or relatives who thought, I wish you weren't doing this, or, but they did. And I'm here because of it. You know what I mean? If they hadn't, they wouldn't have had my grandmother who, or no, wait, that was my great great grandmother. So that was my grandmother's. That was my grandmother's mother. Sorry, I'm like going through the family tree. So my grandmother's mother and father. So if they had not had my grandmother, she wouldn't have had my father, and I wouldn't be here. So that was something, I think, a piece of my own family history that was really compelling to explore as well.
Thank you. One of the questions that has been asked a few times is, to what extent and which characters are based on fact?
Great question. So the characters who are at the center of this story are fictional, but the methods of forgery and how they get into forgery were very much based on fact. So there are two forgers in particular who I based a lot of the methods of the actual forgeries and then of the actual networks on, and those were Oscar Rosowski and Adolfo Kaminsky. So Oscar Rosowski and both were young Jewish men who worked with women in their networks too. But there's more recorded about these men because they were like a little bit more in charge of their networks. So both Rosowski and Kaminsky were young Jewish men who were fleeing from the Germans themselves, falsified documents for themselves and their parents. And that's how they found their way into forgery. Much like Eva, they just sort of discover this talent for it on the fly. And because they have these successfully forged documents, somebody notices them, someone, attached to a resistance network, and recruits them. So that was very much similar to Ava's journey. A lot of the techniques they use are based on techniques that the two of them used. So for example, Adolfo Kaminsky used to work for a dairy conglomerate, and just like Rémy used to in the novel. And that's how he discovered that lactic acid which would be found in milk and cream, can erase Waterman's blue ink, which is a technique that Rémy uses in the novel also. So those things are real. The fact that these resistance networks ran through churches, both Catholic and Protestant, that's real. And so the priest, Père Clément, in the novel is not directly based on a single individual, but he is sort of a representation of the kind of Christian work that was going on to sort of help. There needed to be somebody who could provide, these baptismal certificates or this strong cover or whatever. So a lot of them did run through church networks. And then, as I mentioned earlier, Otto Kuhn, the librarian in Berlin, is based on, I think his name is Sebastian Finsterwalder, who is a real German librarian whose life's work is to return looted books. So there was a lot of real basis for the facts, but not the actual characters themselves.
So another character we could say in the book is the town, is the
Yeah.
village. So one of our readers wanted to know if you'd actually traveled there, that you had such great descriptions of the church, the baker, the bookstore, just the sense, you know, I could see, I'm sure others could as well. We could see ourselves walking through there, and you painted that so vividly. Did you
Well,
actually visit?
Well, that is a great question. And it is one that comes up at almost every virtual talk I do. And I will give you two answers. One is I lived in Paris for a little while in my early 20s. And that's one reason, in addition to my family background on my dad's side, that I think I really feel drawn to continuing to write about France. I feel very comfortable with it. I feel very inspired by the sort of the French way of life, the French culture, gosh, the food, just everything French, right? But for this novel specifically, um, the Orignon is fictional, but it is based very strongly on the real area in which Oscar Rosowski, one of the forgers I mentioned earlier, worked. But I had not specifically been to that French town, and so I did not feel comfortable setting a novel in a place that I hadn't been to. So I used sort of the French towns that I had been to piece together a very realistic town that would work for the setting of the book. And the other reason I chose not to set it in the actual town where Oscar Rosowski had done his work was because I felt like if I put fictional characters in this real tiny town, it would be doing a disservice to the real people who had operated there, who had actually saved real lives and reality. So it made more sense to me from a responsible author viewpoint to fictionalize that setting so that I had a little bit more freedom to work with the characters within the town.
Sorry, some background noise here.
No worries.
It's okay. It's okay, honey. It's lunchtime.
Same here.
So jumping back, I guess, to the beginning of the book, or even ahead to the end without spoilers, why did Eva feel the need to go back to Germany to see the Book of Lost Names, to claim it?
That it's a great question. And I think it's because she thought that it might hold an unanswered question. So one of the things about the Book of Lost Names is that she and Rémy used it ultimately not just to encode the names of children, but to encode messages to each other. And without giving any spoilers, there's something left unanswered. There's a message Eva leaves in the book. And then the book goes missing before she knows whether Rémy has seen it. And so we talked earlier about how Eva thought she could put up a wall to the past and not think of it again. And that's because one of the reasons for that is she thought the book was lost forever. But I think that the book appearing, in a photograph in the New York Times and her recognizing it instantly was the first step to breaking down that wall. And the second that one brick had been knocked out of that wall, basically all the other bricks began tumbling down. And I think that at that point, she had no choice. Like there would have been no way to go on once that wall had been knocked down, knowing that the answer to her question might be out there and that she hasn't gone to get it, if that makes sense.
That totally makes sense. Another sort of follow-up from an earlier line of discussion was about back to the relationship between Eva and her mother, and the fact that her mother blames Eva, or it seems as though her mother blames Eva for her father's capture and possible death.
Yeah, I think the mother, like I said, the mother is a complicated character. And yeah, realistically, what could Eva have done? I mean, but I mean, she couldn't have stopped it. She couldn't have marched out into the hall and said, please don't do this. And they would have said, oh, all right, never mind. He's free. That's just not the way it would have worked. She would have been taken too, as would her mother. But I think the mother immediately feels so powerless and so lost. And as is the case with many of us, sometimes when you feel powerless and lost, the first instinct is to lash out. So I think it's an unreasonable lashing out. And if they had remained in place and not gone anywhere and not moved anywhere, probably the mother would have gotten over it very quickly, and then they would have been arrested subsequently, I imagine. But because the next step is Eva dragging her even further out of her comfort zone, I think that it begins to sort of snowball, and that sense of blame and anger never really goes away, because the mother is so panicked and so out of her element that I think she just doesn't know what to do. It's like she's just kind of flailing and emotionally sort of firing in every direction, if that makes sense.
It definitely does. And I think that's one of the challenges that you handle so beautifully in creating not just these characters, but their relationships and their dynamics with each other. And, as with lots of stories that are out there, but I think certainly in this one, thinking about how any of us might handle this type of
Yeah.
situation, and looking at Eva and how she takes on these tasks that are
Yeah.
these huge challenges. But she does what is necessary in order not only for her to survive, but for
Yeah.
her mother to survive, and potentially her father, all these risks that she takes
Yeah.
for the people she loves. And it's I think, in many ways, at the heart of the story is that love for family, and that sense of, especially as we've all been living through this pandemic, we
Yeah.
take the steps we need to take to keep the people we love safe, and to make sure that we can
Yes. Yes.
um, survive. And it's certainly that's at the heart of the story in so many ways.
Well,
um,
that's such a good point, and I'm glad you mentioned, that does kind of relate to what we've been going through in the pandemic, because I think that's one reason why World War II stories are really particularly resonant right now, because not that there's really any comparison. I mean, that was a much darker time with obviously like horrific things happening that didn't unfold by chance. Like these were things that were happening on purpose, right? But I think I think in that time period, as in this time period, we've learned things about ourselves, and we've learned that we can be part of making a better world, and part of finding this strength within us and finding this light within us and all of those things. And I think a lot of the messages from World War II have resonated particularly strongly this
mm,
last year.
Definitely. One of our readers asks if you're familiar with the book The Marcel Network, about a real couple located in Nice who saved hundreds of children. It's a biography she read recently for another book club. And that couple depended on forgers for documents for the children to help them get to Switzerland and other places.
Oh, that's neat. No, I've never read that book, but it sounds really good. Yeah, there are gosh, so many stories about it, real life stories of these forgery networks that helped people just like that. But thank you. I'll put that on my reading list. That sounds good. I'll have to dig into that too.
So what do you hope that people will take away from this novel?
I think it's what we just mentioned, that idea that we all have it, we're all in our regular lives, in our ordinary lives, we all have it within ourselves to find something extraordinary within us. We can all be that light in the darkness, and it doesn't mean you have to put your life on the line and save hundreds of people to make a difference in the world. You can do something small. You can have courage. You can speak up in defense of somebody. You can simply be kind in your own life. I mean, kindness is something that collectively lifts up the world. You can open your mind to other people's circumstances or other people's plights, and help in a small way if you can. All those little acts of extraordinariness are the things that add up and make the world a better place. So I think that's, Ava finds this reserve of something she didn't know was there, and because of that, hundreds of people that might not have otherwise survived do, and that happened throughout World War II, and I think it has happened throughout history, and I think it's still happening today. We all have a role to play, and I think those small acts of bravery and kindness and goodness make a difference.
That is so true, and certainly such a timely message for us as we've been experiencing what we've been experiencing
Yeah.
in the last year plus.
Yep.
So thank you for the beautiful message and
Thank
reminder.
you.
And I know it's that's, I think, been one of the challenges, is how we
Yeah.
find those opportunities to share that kindness. And I want to think not only about the past and the present, but also about the future.
Yeah.
Because as you mentioned, your upcoming novel, The Forest of Vanishing Stars, is going to be out probably within a
Oh
month,
my
6 weeks.
gosh, like, yeah, like less than 6 weeks now. Isn't that crazy? Gosh,
Very exciting.
it's a busy
So tell
summer
us a
for
little
me.
bit about your upcoming,
Yeah, let me see. If you haven't got
and
it.
we'd love to see the cover.
So this is just the like the advanced reader copy. It'll be a hardback, but you can see the pretty cover. I love it. I really like what they did with the cover. But yeah, that's coming in just 6 weeks. You can pre-order, less than 6 weeks. You can pre-order it now if you're interested. And if you liked the Book of Lost Names, I feel like you would probably like this one. It's a little bit different. It's my first venture out of World War II France. It's World War II Poland, Eastern Poland, and it is based on the incredible, absolutely incredible real life tales of Jewish refugees who survived the war by hiding in the forests. So if you're familiar with the film Defiance, or the book it was based on, which tells the story of the Bielski brothers, who save more than 1,200 Polish Jews in the forest. It is not based directly on them. This is not the story of the Bielskis, but it is based on the way they survived. And it sort of centers around a group that is similar to what their group was before it grew in size. They started out as a group of about 30, and that's the size of the group in my novel. So it's about a group that survives in the forest. But it's also centered on the main character is this young woman named Yona, who was kidnapped from her German parents when she was just 2. And she's taken by this woman named Jerusha, who who's kind of like, who fancies herself kind of this mystic. And she's lived her whole life in the woods. She's a little bit crazy, or maybe she's not, like that's kind of up in the air, but she's crazy enough to kidnap a child, right? So she thinks she's been called by the forest to take this little girl from her parents, who are bad people. And so she raises her totally isolated in the woods with all of the skills she'll need to survive. Like, so she knows how to survive, in the dead of winter in an inhospitable forest, but she doesn't know the first thing about human interaction. So when the old woman dies in 1942, Yona's kind of, moving around the forest alone, and she suddenly encounters a family of fleeing Jewish refugees. And it's her first exposure to what's happening in the world outside the forest, and it changes her life forever. So she becomes involved in a refugee group. But as we mentioned with the Book of Lost Names, you can't run from your past. And so there's an incident that happens that kind of brings her past to the forefront, the family that she came from. And in addition to being sort of this coming of age story for her and a story of survival for these refugees, it's also a story about identity that kind of asks that question, like, who are you? Like, do you carry the sins of your ancestors? Are you who you were born to be? Are you who someone made you into, or are you who you decide to make yourself? So it kind of delves into that question. So it's about fate. There's a love story, and it's very very much based on the real ways people survived in that forest, and some of the tragedies that happened there.
I know we'll be excited to read it and to support it when it comes out.
Thank you.
And before we wrap up, there's another question that came in, which is hopefully a positive way to end, depending on your answer, which is no pressure. But have you ever met families of children who escaped to Switzerland, as in the book?
I have. So prior to writing the book, and then as well, it seems to happen fairly, I shouldn't say fairly frequently, but it happens occasionally. I've done a ton of virtual online things like this year. And I'm sorry that there's a little bit of background noise. My husband's working just across, and there's no door to separate us. So I apologize if you can hear that.
We get it. My daughter's leaving. She's eating her lunch across from me.
My 5-year-old's in the other room doing Legos, and I'm like, wow, it's been a whole hour and he's like still occupied. That's great. But as you said, it's lunchtime. So I know that it's only a matter of time till he comes in. But yeah, one of the neat things about doing all these virtual chats about this book is that every so often I'll have someone in one of the chats who puts in the chat box, as some people have shared things in the chat box today. I am the daughter of hidden children from France, or one of my parents survived the war that way, and that just happened to me 2 days ago. I think it was 2 days ago. I was speaking with a library in Massachusetts, in Mansfield, and one of the women actually got to share her story, which was that both of her parents were hidden children in France. They met after the war in an orphanage, and ended up married, and they're in their 90s, and they now go around to schools and talk to children with their daughter's help, the daughter who was in this meeting, to talk to people about, just to kind of keep those stories and those memories alive. So yeah, it's incredible to talk about, or to talk to people who that really happened to.
Kristin, thank you so much for this morning, for your time, but even more for your words, and both
you.
written and shared today. I know we all really enjoyed reading your book,
Thank
and
you.
those who have not, I'm sure now are inspired to.
I
And
hope so.
and we
Thank
look
you.
forward to reading The Forest of Vanishing Stars, and
Thank
to
you.
potentially having a chance to chat again. And
I
we
would love
thank
that.
you so much.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It was a real pleasure to chat with you today. Thank you.